Welcome to Abide in Liberty, a podcast empowering patriots everywhere to re-enthrone faith, family, and freedom as the bedrock pillars of liberty in education, our communities, and our nation.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome back for another episode. Since last week's episode on the separation of church and state, I have not been able to wait for this one. Before we jump into this episode, though, I could really use your help spreading our message to more people. We need as many people as possible to learn these principles, to understand the Constitution and education and the role that those should all play together. So please, if you would, I would greatly appreciate it if you would take a minute to like and subscribe the podcast, share it with a friend. You know, if you see clips from the podcast floating around on social media, taking a minute to share those, like them, would really go a long way to help us make sure we get picked up by the algorithms. Now, on to the part that I've been really, really excited about. There are many who would make the claim that Christianity was not a part of the founding of our country in any way whatsoever. And this topic goes hand in hand perfectly with the topic of separation of church and state. And you can't really fully explain what separation of church and state really means without establishing that our country was founded as a Christian nation. Now, why does this matter? So the reason why this matters is if you were living 100 years ago and you wanted to undermine God and get him out of schools, out of the courthouses, out of government, you have a little bit of a problem. Number one, most of the country is Christian. And you have that pesky First Amendment that says that only the federal government can't establish an official government-sponsored religion. But if you can prove that the founders were purely secular, Enlightenment thinkers, you can start to argue that maybe they meant more by the First Amendment than they actually did. This is kind of a two-step attack. You have to attack the faith of the founders first so that you can then inject more meaning and religious hostility into the First Amendment than the founders themselves saw, or that the subsequent 150 years of Americans that came after them saw. And this attack actually has been going on for decades, but it's been renewed in a CNN article, an op-ed, that was entitled "An Imposter Christianity is Threatening American Democracy." And there's a lot that this article goes into, but it attacks these two things specifically. Now, this isn't new. It's just kind of been rebranded and repackaged today. So under the heading that was kind of saying that white Christian nationalists believe this lie that our nation was founded as a Christian one, this article says, quote, "Erasing the line separating piety from politics is a key characteristic of white Christian nationalism. Many want to reduce or erase the separation of church and state." And then second quote, "One of the most popular beliefs among these white Christian nationalists is that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation. The founding fathers," and then it says that we believe that the founding fathers were all Orthodox evangelical Christians, and God has chosen the U.S. for a special role in history. And yeah, that sounds pretty good. You know, I'm not a quote unquote white Christian nationalist, but I do believe those things. And I don't just believe them, I know them to be true. We've got to be prepared to defend the Christian founding of our nation from these underhanded, dishonest, and unprovable claims that just get so much popular attention and that, frankly, a lot of people have come to believe over the years. We've got to understand this also to make sure that we understand what the Constitution actually says about separation of church and state, as well as what the founders intended for the legal protection of religious observance. So to do that, let's jump right into what the founders actually had to say about this. A lot of people will make the claim that the founders, the majority of them weren't actually Christian at all. In fact, the majority of them were deists. Now, a deist is a person who believes that God doesn't intervene in the affairs of his children, of people. And that's very different from the Christian God who is active in the lives of his children. And kind of the four big suspects that people like to point to as being very obviously deists are Benjamin Franklin, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison. Now, I want to start off by looking at what these four individuals in particular said about Christianity and the founding of our nation. Benjamin Franklin is one who's popularly pointed out as being a deist because in his own autobiography, he does say that in his younger years, he was tempted and he kind of liked the idea of deism. But by the time he was playing on the American Revolution stage, that phase of his life had long since passed. He actually was on one of the committees that was tasked with proposing a national seal, and his design for what should be on that national seal depicted Moses and Pharaoh at this moment when Pharaoh is in the middle of the Red Sea and Moses is commanding the Red Sea to come back to where it was and swallow up the Egyptians. And the motto that Benjamin Franklin proposed to go along with the seal was, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God." And then one of my favorite stories of Benjamin Franklin is during the Constitutional Convention. For a number of weeks, the delegates had been arguing and bickering, and they'd kind of reached a stalemate and had been there for a while. This was in the middle of a sweltering Philadelphia summer. They were closed in. All the windows were barred in order to maintain secrecy, and it had just been kind of a nasty atmosphere with not a lot of progress happening, especially when it came to representation, right? The smaller states wanted equal votes for each state. The bigger states wanted more representation based on population, and they just couldn't get past this. So Benjamin Franklin rises up and gives this speech. He says, "In this situation of this assembly, groping as it were in the dark to find political truth, and scarce able to distinguish it when presented to us, how has it happened, sir?" And you hear him addressing this sir. He's addressing the president of the convention, which is George Washington. "How has it happened, sir, that we have not hitherto once thought of humbly applying to the Father of lights to illuminate our understandings? In the beginning of the contest with Great Britain, when we were sensible of danger, we had daily prayer in this room for divine protection. Our prayers, sir, were heard, and they were graciously answered. All of us who were engaged in the struggle must have observed frequent instances of a superintending providence in our favor. To that kind providence we owe this happy opportunity of consulting in peace on the means of establishing our future national felicity. And have we now forgotten that powerful friend? Or do we imagine that we no longer need his assistance? I have lived, sir, a long time, and the longer I live, the more convincing proofs I see of this truth, that God governs in the affairs of men. And if a sparrow cannot fall to the ground without his notice, is it probable that an empire can rise without his aid? We have been assured, sir, in the sacred writings that except the Lord build, they labor in vain that build it. I firmly believe this. And I also believe that without his concurring aid, we shall succeed in this political building no better than the builders of Babel. We shall be divided by our little partial local interests. Our projects will be confounded, and we ourselves shall become a reproach and a byword down to future age. And what is worse, mankind may hereafter from this unfortunate instance despair of establishing governments by human wisdom and leave it to chance, war, and conquest. I therefore beg leave to move that henceforth prayers imploring the assistance of heaven and its blessings on our deliberations be held in this assembly every morning before we proceed to business, and that one or more of the clergy of this city be requested to officiate in that service." You know, when I hear this, I see us at a similar crossroads. There's lots of petty bickering and local interest, and you don't have to look much farther than your social media feed to see it. God built this country. He created the foundation. He created that original building. But since then, we've made additions and we've made alterations and we've taken away pieces of that without him. We've been trying to build our own tower to the sky. You know, we try to set up human reason and human wisdom as the ultimate good and as the ultimate truth in the universe. But if we don't course correct, we'll fulfill Franklin's prophetic warning and we'll be left to chance, war, and conquest. All right, let's jump over to George Washington. Some claim that Washington didn't bring God into his presidency because there's not a single contemporary account of him saying the words, "So help me God," when he took his oath of office. But what these people will neglect to point out is that he insisted on taking oath on the Bible, and after he gave his oath of office, he kissed the Bible and then went straight to St. Paul's Church for service after the ceremony. There's a good reason why someone didn't remark that he had said the words, "So help me God," and that's because those words were very common to say after any oath. And the fact that that was so common, the fact that nobody really commented on it, if he hadn't said, "So help me God," after that oath, almost certainly somebody would have noted that, and it would have been a cause of concern. So the fact that wasn't brought up and that no one made mention of it is actually pretty good evidence that he kind of behaved in accordance with what they were expecting and said exactly those words. But even if he didn't, placing your hand on the Bible, kissing it afterwards, I think kind of gets the point across, even if the words didn't. Later, in speaking about the Constitution, he said, "It appears to me, then, little short of a miracle, that the Constitution, demonstrates as visibly the finger of providence as any possible event in the course of human affairs can ever designate it." Also, in responding to chiefs of the Delaware tribe who brought him 3 youths to be trained in American schools, he responded and said, "You do well to wish to learn our arts and ways of life, and above all, the religion of Jesus Christ. These will make you a greater and happier people than you are. Congress will do everything they can to assist you in this wise intention." Speaking about seeing God's hand during the American Revolution, he said, "The hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations." And then in his farewell address, as he was stepping down from the presidency, he said, "Of all the dispositions and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to subvert these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens." Now on to Jefferson. After completing a treaty, he sent it to the Kaskaskia Indians, and in that treaty, he agreed to give $100 per year to support a Catholic priest for the tribe after most of the tribe had been converted to Catholicism. He also, let's not forget, was the author of the Declaration of Independence, and he said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." So how can somebody who believes in an inactive, uncaring God claim that that same God endowed his creations with rights that would lead to their happiness if they were to follow them? Jefferson also said, "God who gave us life gave us liberty. Can the liberties of a nation be secure when we have removed a conviction that these liberties are the gift of God? Indeed, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just, that his justice cannot sleep forever. Commerce between master and slave is despotism. Nothing is more certainly written in the book of fate than that these people are to be free." Now, and these aren't obscure quotes. One of them is in the Declaration of Independence, and this last one is on the northwest portico of the Jefferson Memorial. And this is not something a deist would say. A deist would never say that he trembles for his country because he's worried that because we've endorsed slavery, because that's something that's continued, God is going to come and seek retribution and seek recompense for that wickedness. That's not an unfeeling, uncaring God who just has stepped out of human affairs altogether. That's not the language of a deist. Oh, and also, by the way, Jefferson regularly attended worship services in the Capitol building, and so did James Madison. James Madison himself issued 4 presidential calls for public prayer. In the second one, he recommended to all those who felt so inclined to unite their hearts and voices in addressing at one and the same time their vows and adorations to the great parent and sovereign of the universe. He also said, "A watchful eye must be kept on ourselves, lest, while we are building ideal monuments of renown and bliss here, we neglect to have our names enrolled in the annals of heaven." Now, it is true, and it's pretty obvious from the evidence, that Jefferson and Madison both wanted more separation between religious and government than most of their contemporaries, most of the people that were with him and that we consider the other founders. But even the separation that they wanted is nowhere near what modern separationists inject into the meaning of Jefferson's famous separation of church and state quote. They would be absolutely appalled at how their words and how the Constitution itself have been twisted beyond recognition. Hopefully, it's pretty obvious by now that all of these quotes are not the words of a professed deist, and they're certainly not the words of a purely secular thinker. And the other important thing to realize is that Washington, Franklin, Jefferson, and Madison didn't create this country, didn't found this country in a vacuum. There were many, many others, dozens others who made this possible. For example, Jefferson was not even in the country during the Constitutional Convention. Now, these are some of the most popular founding fathers today, but this country's founding was a team effort. It was a team sport, and there were a lot of people on that team. So what about the dozens of other influential founders that were wildly influential in their day, even if they aren't as well known in ours? Samuel Adams, signer of the Declaration of Independence, said, "I rely upon the merits of Jesus Christ for pardon of all my sins." Alexander Hamilton, who was a signer of the Constitution and was one of the few people behind getting the Constitutional Convention to happen in the first place, he was one of the single most influential figures in getting the Constitution ratified as the main author of the Federalist Papers. And he worked hand in hand during Washington's first 2 terms in the presidency to get the new government off the ground. I mean, this guy, his influence on the founding of America cannot be overstated. He said, "I have a tender reliance on the mercy of the Almighty through the merits of the Lord Jesus Christ." John Hancock, signer of the Declaration of Independence, the one with the biggest signature, the one that wrote it so big because he wanted to make sure that King George III could see his signature even without his spectacles on. He called on the state of Massachusetts to pray that all nations may bow to the scepter of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, and that the whole earth may be filled with his glory. Patrick Henry, the give me liberty or give me death guy, said, "Being a Christian is a character which I prize far above all this world has or can boast." Roger Sherman, who was one of the few people who both signed the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution itself. This is also the guy who came up with the compromise that broke the deadlock in the Constitutional Convention over representation. He's the one that suggested that the House of Representatives have proportional representation and that the Senate have equal representation for each state. Kind of an influential figure. He said, "I believe that there is one only living and true God existing in 3 persons, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost, the same in substance, equal in power and glory. That the scriptures of the Old and New Testaments are a revelation from God and a complete rule to direct us how we may glorify and enjoy him." John Witherspoon, a signer of the Declaration of Independence, said, "There is no salvation in any other than Jesus Christ of Nazareth." Justice Story, who was one of the first Supreme Court justices and widely considered one of the greatest constitutional scholars our country has ever had, said, "We are not to attribute this prohibition of national religious establishment to an indifference to religion in general, and especially to Christianity, which none could hold in more reverence than the framers of the Constitution. The general, if not universal sentiment in America was that Christianity ought to receive encouragement from the state. To make it a matter of state policy to hold all in utter indifference would have created universal disapprobation or disapproval, if not universal indignation." The 1853 to 1854 House and Senate Judiciary Committee reports said this. The House report said, "Christianity was the religion of the founders of the Republic, and they expected it to remain the religion of their descendants. The Senate report said the clause speaks, they're talking about the First Amendment, of an establishment of religion. What is meant by that expression? It referred without a doubt to that establishment which existed in the mother country. This is what we talked about last week. They were trying to avoid an official religion that they saw in their mother country in Great Britain, which was an endowment at public expense in exclusion of or in preference to any other by giving to its members exclusive political rights and by compelling the attendance of those who rejected its communion. They did not intend to spread over all the public authorities and the whole public action of the nation the dead and revolting spectacle of atheistical apathy. In the court case, Church of the Holy Trinity versus United States, 1892, the Supreme Court said no purpose of action against religion can be imputed to any legislation, state or national, because this is a religious people. This is a Christian nation. Later on in the opinion, they reiterated that and said that the Christian religion is a part of the common law. And there are many other court cases that say basically this same thing, beginning at the founding of our country all the way up to the early 1900s. And some of those, and this is just a small sampling, include Up de Graaf versus the Commonwealth, 1892, The People versus Ruggles, 1811, Vidal versus Gerard's Executors, 1844, Commonwealth versus Abner Kneeland, 1838, and the list goes on and on. Now, with all of these quotes, I spent a decent amount of time on this, but I could have easily spent hours just going over the many, many quotes by the founding fathers, by Supreme Courts, different presidents, all pointing to the same thing, that our country was obviously founded as a Christian nation. I just picked out a few of my favorites. Now, one of the most popular counter-arguments to America being founded as a Christian nation comes from the Treaty of Tripoli, which says, and there's a quote in there, and this is what it says: "The government of the United States is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." Now, taken at face value and taken out of context, that sounds pretty black and white, pretty clear, but context is important. So to go back a little bit in history, after the American and British divorce, Great Britain stopped protecting American merchants in the Mediterranean from North African pirates. So there were just tons of American merchant ships that were being taken captive. Their crews were taken and enslaved in Africa by these nations. And in 1786, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson had the opportunity to ask Tripoli's ambassador why they were attacking our merchant ships when the U.S. had done nothing at all to harm them. And the response was that the Quran said that the Prophet Muhammad had commanded his followers to make war on nations who don't believe in the Quran. And that was their understanding of the Quran and of that religion. So at a minimum, what it looks like is this statement in Article 11 of this treaty was a practical matter for seeking peace. And from a traditional sense, what they were saying was true. For many, many nations, for hundreds of years, these nations were set up with state-sponsored religions. You could only attend this church. You could only participate in government if you belonged to the official church of the state. And in that sense, America was not founded as a quote-unquote Christian government because there was no religious test that you had to pass in order to participate in government. So hypothetically speaking, the people could elect a Muslim senator or a Muslim president or an atheistic representative. That was all possible. So the people who are drafting this treaty and trying to seek peace, that's the case that they were making. And that's what they were trying to say in this treaty, that look, we're not England where we have an official Christian church, that if the people want, they can elect anybody from any religion into public office. So in that way, they were different. And this is not just different compared to their neighbors, but this is different compared to how the world had been run and how nations had been run for hundreds, if not thousands of years. Now, it's also interesting to note, and this often gets overlooked, but later revisions of that treaty had that little statement removed. And the other thing that kind of undermines this argument that this treaty is the definitive statement on whether or not America was founded as a Christian nation is the mountain of evidence and mountain of quotes that say just the opposite. You've got this one kind of interesting little statement in this treaty, but when you hold that one little piece of evidence up against the mountain of evidence to the contrary, it really is a pretty weak argument. Now, we couldn't do justice to this topic without addressing what is probably one of the most famous quotes on the subject, and it comes from John Adams. He said, "Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other." Now, I used to scratch my head over this one and wonder why that was the case. What specifically about the Constitution makes it so that it only works for religious people? And if they knew that, if the founding fathers knew that that was the case, why couldn't they have made it work and make it functional, even if people were to start moving away from faith and moving away from religion? And that had puzzled me for a lot of years until I came across a quote from Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson that really gave me the piece of the puzzle that I was missing. Benjamin Franklin said, "Only a virtuous people are capable of freedom. As nations become corrupt and vicious, they have need of more masters." Now, he uses the word virtuous, but it's important to point out that that word in his day, if we go to the 1828 Noah Webster Dictionary, means being morally good and conforming to moral law. It means being obedient and in conformance to moral and divine law. It also has to do with chastity and all these other things that we kind of think about today too. But obedience to divine law is part and parcel with being virtuous. So that would have been implicit in that statement. And then moving on to what is probably my number one absolute favorite quote by Thomas Jefferson. He said, "The precepts of philosophy and of the Hebrew code lay hold of actions only. He, Jesus, pushed his scrutinies into the heart of man, erected his tribunal in the region of thoughts, and purified the waters at the fountainhead." Now, to kind of drive home what he's talking about here, we have to go to Matthew chapter 5. This is where Christ is giving the Sermon on the Mount. He says, "Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill. And whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart." So when Thomas Jefferson is talking about how Christ pushed scrutinies into the heart of man and purified the waters at the fountainhead, he's talking about this part from Matthew 5. It's not just don't kill, but don't even get angry. And it's not enough just to not commit adultery, but don't even look on a woman to lust after her. Don't even have impure thoughts. So what John Adams, what Thomas Jefferson, and what Benjamin Franklin are saying is that the Constitution was designed to maximize freedom, but it's only possible if people are governing themselves by striving with everything they've got to live righteous, virtuous lives. And Jefferson thought that the Christian faith was best for a free society because it inspires people to govern and bridle their hearts, their thoughts, and their feelings, not just their actions. Now, imagine how powerful that really is. If you have an entire population that is trying as best as they can to not even get angry, how many murders are there? How many violent crimes would there be? Also, if that same entire population, that same country is desperately trying not to have unclean, adulterous thoughts, imagine how few homes would be broken if they were all doing their best to control these thoughts. Pedophilia, rape, incest, infidelity, divorce, human trafficking, the plague of pornography, virtually gone. Adams, Franklin, and Jefferson are not saying that the Constitution is weak because it only works if you're religion. It wasn't a half measure that, we kind of settled on this. We kind of settled on a lesser constitution because it only works for religious people. They're saying that freedom without faith in God and religion is simply impossible because the result is a people who become increasingly depraved and need more masters. They need more oversight. They need more laws. They need more police to police them and make sure that they're not hurting themselves and hurting other people, because they're not doing that themselves. There is no fear of eternal consequence for their actions if you don't have that religious background. Now, this is concerning to me because I hear a whole lot today, and there's a large movement to try and re-enthrone constitutional government. We talk about the need to get back to constitutional principles and to shun Marxist philosophies, and I agree 100% with that. But getting back to the maximum freedom found in the Constitution as it was originally intended to be is not possible without also returning and re-enthroning God in our society. And the scriptures back up what John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, and Thomas Jefferson are saying. Doctrine and Covenants 101, verse 77 and 80 say, according to the laws and constitution of the people, which I, God, have suffered to be established and should be maintained, for the rights and protection of all flesh, according to just and holy principles, and for this purpose have I established the constitution of this land by the hands of wise men whom I raised up unto this very purpose, and redeemed the land by the shedding of blood. 1 Nephi chapter 13, verse 19 says, and I, Nephi, beheld that the Gentiles that had gone out of captivity were delivered by the power of God out of the hands of all other nations. God was in the American Revolution. Ether chapter 2, verse 12 says, behold, this, talking about the American continent, is a choice land, and whatsoever nation shall possess it shall be free from bondage and from captivity and from all other nations under heaven, if they will but serve the God of the land, who is Jesus Christ. 2 Nephi chapter 1, verse 7, wherefore this land is consecrated unto him whom he shall bring. And if it so be that they shall serve him according to the commandments which he hath given, it shall be a land of liberty unto them. Wherefore they shall never be brought down into captivity. If so, it shall be because of iniquity. For if iniquity shall abound, cursed shall be the land for their sakes, but unto the righteous it shall be blessed forever. If they're righteous, they'll be blessed with liberty. If not, captivity is the only option, because they will not be able to govern themselves. For those out there who don't believe in God or who hate him and anyone who believes in them, or if you think that the way the founders saw the world is not correct, or you don't agree with the way that they saw the world, you're entitled to that belief and that opinion, but you are not entitled to your own facts, and you're not entitled to remake history in your own image and then shove it down the rest of our throats. You don't get to interpret the Constitution and twist it into something that those who wrote it never intended. You do, though, have the freedom in this great country, this great free country, to persuade your fellow citizens to your point of view. And if you can convince enough of them, 3/4 of all the states, you can pass an amendment to make the Constitution actually say what you've been trying so hard to make it say through lies, temper tantrums, reinterpretation, and rewriting history. Because like it or not, and I personally love it, the United States of America was founded on Christianity. God himself inspired its founding and the documents that have produced an unprecedented era of prosperity and freedom, and it's spread throughout the entire globe. The founders relied on God. They saw his hand guiding their actions. They believed in him and they worshiped him and founded a free nation that would remain free so long as its people continued to fear, love, worship, and obey the God of heaven that they worshiped. Yes, we absolutely need to re-enthrone the Constitution. We need to learn it, we need to love it, and we need to live by it. But doing that without also re-enthroning God will get us absolutely nowhere. Half measures won't work. You have to have both. God is freedom, and freedom without him, even with the Constitution that he inspired, is simply not possible. The founders knew it, and it's high time we rediscover that truth ourselves. And it is way past time to make darn sure that our kids know it too.
Thank you for listening to Abide in Liberty. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes, and share this with friends and family. In the meantime, keep up with the show online at abideinliberty.com. Also, if you'd like to help our K-12 bless and educate more families, contact us by visiting libertyyouthacademy.org. Until next time, be on the alert, stand firm in the faith, and be strong.